There we go. Looks like we are muted a little bit. Okay, so this is the last AMA of the year, and hopefully everything is coming through okay. Looks like we have a lot of questions already, so I'm just going to jump right in. Here's the first one from Vedant. What is the deepest or most complex philosophical concept you've ever come across? That's tough to say, in part because, you may have seen me say similar things when people ask about like the best or greatest or, these things that are superlative. Usually we talk as if there's like rankings and stuff like that, but usually that's not the case. And so if you're talking about complexity, that's, you could say things are very simple and it's easy to measure simple things against each other. I don't know that it's easy to measure or map complexity against each other. And what counts as a philosophical concept? If it's a complex philosophical concept, it's probably containing other or integrating other philosophical concepts, isn't it? So, where do we draw the line between one concept and a network that it's part of? So, I don't know that I can actually answer that question in any intelligent way. And as far as depth, I don't know that I consider philosophical concepts deep or shallow. Um, Handlings of them, interpretations of them, you know, I think we could say any genuinely philosophical concept is already going to have some depth to it. But I don't know how we compare those productively against each other. Here's a very specific one. Is specific and yet also very general in certain respects as well. Um, is it unethical to boil a lobster alive just to eat it? So I would say offhand, no. And there's reasons why we could say that. But I think that asking, is it unethical to X, is usually not a great way to think about ethical or moral matters, because what you're presuming there is that you're always going to be looking at it from a perspective, not just like there's no like ethical or unethical per se that everybody right minded agrees upon throughout all history. Doesn't mean everything is up for grabs. It doesn't mean we have to be relativists, but you're always operating from some sort of perspective. So you'd want to like specify unethical from what perspective. Now, there's some things that would be sort of helpful. I mean, when I read that question, I was like, well, if it is going to be unethical to boil a lobster to eat it, it seems to me like it would be worse, if we want to say more unethical, to boil a lobster alive to not eat it just for the sake of boiling it alive. If we're going to say that it's unethical to begin with, at least if you're eating it, you're getting something out of it. And it's weird, isn't it? Because lobster used to be like a really poor person's food. They served it to prisoners and servants and people like that. And now it's like a luxury food. It might be more unethical for me to eat it, since I don't actually enjoy lobster much, than for my wife, who actually does enjoy lobster, to eat it. At least we're making some use of it. But I don't think it's like unethical per se. We are predator creatures, or omnivores that eat all sorts of things, and you can kill a lobster in a variety of different ways. It strikes me that, given that scientists aren't in agreement about whether they even feel pain or not, like other arthropods, it'd be one thing if you're like, would it be bad to boil a cow alive so that you could eat it. I mean, a cow, you definitely know it feels pain and you want its suffering to be over very quickly, right? But a lobster, I mean, think about other things. Would it be wrong to roast a cricket or a locust very quickly and have, if it does have pain, over with very quickly? I don't think so. Um, so yeah, that to me, that's a it's not one I think about very often, right? All right, here's a more philosophy text oriented one. Not an academic. Any advice for getting into the phenomenology of perception? So that's Maurice Merleau-Ponty, one of his major works, an early work too. What's a good direction to head afterwards, perhaps into Max Shaler? I've fallen in love with phenomenology and would like further recommendations. Okay, so a lot of different questions there. So, if you are going to be reading Merleau-Ponty, I would say the phenomenology of perception is a good place to start. He does have the structure of comportment before that, but the phenomenology of perception was the work that really like made his reputation early on. And it's funny too because at the time Husserl hadn't been translated into French, and so a lot of people were assuming that Merleau-Ponty was representing Husserl in a um, much more accurate way, much more faithful way, and that this is just sort of like, a student of Husserl depicting his stuff. And it turns out, no, that's not quite true. The conception of the bracketing or epoche is different in Merleau-Ponty than it is in Husserl. By the way, a concept that's not being used the same way in other phenomenologists. It's not as if Husserl is the guy for phenomenology. Um, the phenomenology of perception is a complex work. I actually worked through it with a client last year, and we agreed that it's quite interesting, but also in many parts quite painstaking and boring, like Husserl. And you just got to kind of plow through those and figure out, well, what is he actually getting at? Um, Now, as far as the other questions, I'm not sure why you would head afterwards to Max Shaler. Shaler is dead by the time that Merleau-Ponty, who does cite Shaler, is working on the phenomenology of perception. So he's a precursor, and he's definitely worth reading. There's a whole bunch of early phenomenologists that would be worth reading, who would include Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger and Max Shaler. They're sort of like the big three early on. And then, Edith Stein is worth checking out. And then it kind of like, there's all these people who study under Husserl, who include people you might not immediately associate, like Ortega y Gasset, Jean-Paul Sartre, Jan Patočka. There's all sorts of interesting people doing phenomenology. And I will say, speaking of Edith Stein, she was actually invited to the first Thomistic Institute, I think it was called. It was the Day of Thomistic Studies in 1932. And I actually have that document here. I made photocopies of it and had it sent to Alistair McIntyre, who was working on Edith Stein at the time. He's got a great biography of her. And yeah, that was quite interesting because the Thomists were interested in phenomenology because they saw them as doing similar things. So they were trying to have like a let's talk about our different traditions and see how they fit in with each other. So yeah, those are some people that I would check out. I mean, there's people doing phenomenology today. It's still a very vital movement. Another student of Max Shaler, Dietrich von Hildenbrand, quite an important thinker. Gabriel Marcel is also a phenomenologist, so I would check him out. And he's pretty early on. I mean, he's fitting in there with Husserl, Heidegger, um, Shaler. He's starting at that time. And then there's a couple thinkers that are doing phenomenology, but they're not calling it phenomenology. So Henri Bergson, with his focus on the immediate givens of consciousness, right, was the proper translation of his first book, which we translate in English as Time and Free Will. And then, of course, Maurice Blondel, with his philosophy of immanence, right, or method of immanence from Oxford 1893 onward, is in effect doing phenomenology, as so many scholars have recognized. So that's already a lot of name dropping, but that'll get you started, perhaps. All right. James says you emphasize reading primary sources. Do you think that there's any area of philosophy or individual philosopher where secondary literature is particularly important for understanding them? Oh, that's a great question. And I do want to make a distinction here, right? When we talk about primary, secondary literature, these are very broad and blocky categories. I would say that there's a good bit of what we would technically call secondary literature that is, in effect, its own primary literature, engaging in reinterpretation, in commentary. And that's not the same thing as just like, here's, Heidegger in 30 minutes, or doing monographs or stuff like that. So I mentioned Heidegger. When you're reading Heidegger on Plato or Nietzsche or whoever, Kant, Heidegger talks a lot about Kant, you are getting somebody who is doing, you could say, secondary literature, but it's also at a very high level and could be its own. I mean, maybe we have to call it 1.5 literature, something like that. I would say the same thing with Deleuze's history of philosophy works, which also includes a significant part of the logic of sense, or essays, critical and clinical as well. So coming back to the original question, are there philosophers or areas of philosophy where secondary literature is particularly important for studying or understanding them? I mean, the more difficult the philosopher, probably the more you're going to get out of engaging with people who aren't just like writing a history of philosophy or some general stuff. And they're not just like, doing a Cambridge companion to blah, 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 but they're actually like spending a lot of their own time thinking about them. So, for example, one of the classical commentaries on Hegel's phenomenology is by Jean Hippolyte. And I think it's pretty good. Does it cover everything? No. And of course, you're getting it from a particular take, but you're certainly going to get more out of that than, looking at Russell's history of philosophy and his assessment of Hegel. Because I don't think Russell understood a lot of the people he was criticizing very well. So, there's nothing wrong with reading secondary literature, but you don't want to just primarily read secondary literature. And you don't want the way in which the conception of the philosopher and their work and their approach that you got from the secondary literature to be blinders when you're actually going to the primary text. This is a big problem for, movements like, for example, Thomism, who, they're like, well, I know all I need to know about Aristotle because I've read, Thomas Aquinas. I mean, parts of the Summa. Nobody's read the whole of it as far as I've ever met. And, I've read these 20th century or 21st century thinkers who talk about Thomas's take on Aristotle. And you're like, well, there's more to Aristotle than just what Thomas gleaned from him. And a lot of these guys are, approaching things in very schematic ways. So that's, you want to be kind of careful with the secondary lit, right? And I think that's probably enough about that. Mark says, hey, Greg. Hey, everyone. I hope you're all well. Did you have a good Thanksgiving? Yeah, I did. And it's good to see you here, Mark. For those of you who don't know Mark, he and I have been corresponding for over a decade and meet regularly. And he's a philosopher down in South Africa. And we have a lot in common. Yeah, Thanksgiving was pretty good. Very low key. Me and my wife and my kid Kat, we all went out to a Serbian restaurant. So we didn't have to cook anything. We didn't have to clean anything. We could have had turkey if we wanted to, but we had Serbian stuff instead. I had some really good goulash, and we had some wonderful appetizers, and finished it up with some nice desserts, and took some food home as well. So yeah, that was quite good. All right, so Keta Mateo, I just finished After Virtue and didn't really understand McIntyre's point that Stoicism is not a teleological system. Do you agree with his conclusion? I don't think that McIntyre makes that point, that it's not a teleological system. I mean, what he does is he misinterprets Stoicism in that work. Later on, he'll revise it because Anthony Long takes him to task in a work. Just as, McIntyre also got Kierkegaard wrong, and the Kierkegaard people, criticized him. And then he's like, yeah, okay, maybe I'm wrong about that. But he was reading Stoicism in a very common way as sort of like a Kantianism before Kant. So he was reading it as sort of a type of deontology. And if what you mean by it not being teleological is that it's deontological, it's duty driven, then that could be the case. But I mean, McIntyre knows that the Stoics do think that human beings have a telos, right? Which is happiness. I mean, the Stoics are pretty clear about that. So what I would do is I would not worry over much about what you think McIntyre didn't understand at the time that he wrote that, and keep reading on in the tetralogy, because now that you've read After Virtue, you've got Whose Justice, Which Rationality, then Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry, then Rational Dependent Animals, and they're all part of a big sort of developing system. All right, let's see. Luke, would you say the concept of ressentiment could help explain the support for the United CEO killer? I would say the opposite, actually. We don't really know that much about the United CEO killer. We know that, and we don't know that much about the motivations of people who think that, this is a good thing, or at least a deserved thing. And, if you have to think about like who deserves to be killed, people who make decisions that cut people off from healthcare that they've paid for in order to get their bonuses and exercise power and hang out with rich stockholders. I think there's quite a few people who would say, yeah, that guy had it coming to him. And maybe a lot of other CEOs doing similarly shady practices do it all. So I don't think that ressentiment is a useful concept to explain this. And it seems a little suspect that would be the go-to, to try to explain why people find this action acceptable or laudable. You would have to, in order to make sense of that, you would actually have to like look at the characteristics of ressentiment, and you would have to find people saying things that actually fit that. And then you could say, okay, this concept does apply. David says, hello to all. These are always fun discussions. Well, I'm glad that you enjoy them. All right. Miles says, I'll be organizing and editing an issue of an undergrad journal of philosophy and religious studies in the spring. Any advice for a project like this? Yeah, as a matter of fact, I do have some, but it's going to strike you as probably a bit cynical. So, I mean, first of all, you want to figure out, is there a like a theme? If it's one particular issue, I mean, if you're by in the spring, you mean you're starting the work in the spring? Okay, then you got plenty of time to plan because you're probably going to do like a call for papers, and you'll put it out 6 months in advance. If you haven't put the call for papers out yet and you're doing it in the spring, it's a bit late for that. That could be a problem unless it's just anybody send whatever papers you want in. Um, but the helpful advice would be things like, so people are going to not meet deadlines that they're supposed to meet, and don't be afraid to be firm, not overly wordy, but very clear with the people that you want to get work done, and email them and say, hey, deadline is this, you're past the deadline, got to get it in. You can even say, I don't mean to be a nag, but I'm going to be a nag, because that's part of what it means to be an editor. The other thing is, don't be a perfectionist about stuff. You want things to meet certain standards, but there's going to be typos. There's going to be sentences that aren't perfectly clear. So, it's good enough if you get to 75%, you could say. You're never going to get to 100% on these sorts of projects. And, the other cool thing is you're probably going to get exposed to ideas and approaches that maybe you yourself aren't all that conversant with. So it's an opportunity for growing. And if people get, here's the last bit of advice. If people get kind of pissy with you, like when you give them feedback, right? So maybe it's blind reviewed and you got two reviewers and you give them the reviewers' feedback, and then they get all upset with you because they thought that their darling article was perfect as it was. Don't take it personal. It's not about you. It's about their thing and what they're up to. That's the advice I would give you. All right, Elijah Miller, good to see you. How might Blondel and Kierkegaard respond to Cicero's ideas about how to distribute charity to others according to merits? I don't know. I mean, I think they would say, yeah, in a lot of cases, that's perfectly fine. They're not committed to, you have to be charitable to everybody all the time, no matter what. It's the very fact of something being charity means that you choose to give it. So they might say, well, in ancient times, it was much more common to think. I mean, the person you'd want to go to on this is Shaler. We've brought up Shaler earlier in the book Chrysanthemum. He actually talks about that, love, benevolence in ancient times. There's this sense of, well, I've only got so much, it's scarce, so I need to be careful with what I give. It's reasonable to do that if you have that assumption. If you think that through the absurd or through God's action in us or something like that, that maybe we can go beyond that, which most ancients didn't believe, well, then that opens up other options for you, I would say, right? All right, Bob says, for what it's worth, what are the four most critical sections of the phenomenology? Again, there aren't that four most critical sections of the phenomenology. There isn't a most critical section of the phenomenology, because I don't have any idea what you mean by critical. Most important, is that what you mean? And it's going to depend on who you ask. I mean, I think that the master slave dialectic gets way more press than it actually deserves, because people, are kind of attracted to power dynamics, and it's nice and short, so you can anthologize it easily, and it doesn't require as much work as going through the longer sections. But even in the self-consciousness section, I would say the stoicism, skepticism, and unhappy consciousness, which is much longer than the master slave dialectic, is more interesting and closer to reality. I mean, the master slave dialectic is not meant to be a blueprint for all human relations throughout all time. It's a very early stage. I tend to find the stuff in the reason and spirit section the most interesting. And I tend to be attracted, I'll, level with you, to the stuff that has to do with moral life and less with science, although the physiognomy and phrenology part is pretty useful for thinking about the rather wild claims made by some people in the present about neuroscience or, you know, evil biology or stuff like that. But I like the morality section, but that's me. I mean, I'm not the decider of what the most important sections of the phenomenology are. I mean, if Hegel's to be taken at his word, it's probably the final section, absolute knowing, right? Because everything is coming together. But I find that a little bit disappointing myself. But I'm not a Hegelian. I'm just a guy who, knows a good bit about Hegel and commented on his works. All right. Let's see. Let's find somebody we haven't had already. Galen says, I want to let everyone know if you do philosophy audiobooks, Audible's having a massive sale. Okay, that's great. All right, Max is here. Good to see you. Have you ever thought about doing a self-directed study video on Maurice Blondel? Yeah, I mean, I've thought about doing self-directed study videos on dozens of people that I haven't gotten to yet. I just haven't gotten to them yet, you know? Um, it's a matter of, it's not a matter of like thinking about it or desiring to do it. It's a matter of finding the time to do it. And also a bit of triage. I think there's less people interested in Blondel than there are in some of the people that I'm hitting on early on in it. Like the next one that I want to do is on Augustine, and we'll see if I get it done this month or not. you know um Augustine and Blondel are both really important philosophers, but I think doing the self-directed study on Augustine first is probably the smart move as far as like helping people out, because there aren't that many people that are like, yeah, man, just can't wait to do Blondel, right? So all right. Spiral asks what to do if nothing makes you happy anymore. Oh, that's a good question. I would say first thing you can do is ask yourself, is that really true? Or are you overstating it? And what do you mean by being happy? Like, do you mean that you have zero joy whatsoever at any moment in anything that you do? I mean, if that's the case, then you need to go see a therapist and probably um, get on some sort of medication, right? Because that sounds like a pretty significant issue. If what you mean is you're not as happy as you used to be, or you don't find the same joy in activities or relationships or things as you used to, that could be a sign that you're ready for something new. It could be a sign that you're depressed. It depends on all sorts of things. So it really um, requires you, I think, to like flesh that out and figure out what you mean by nothing makes you happy anymore. Right. And once you do that, once you've got a sense of the what you actually mean, then you can start looking at the why. Well, what changed, or why don't you enjoy things anymore? And then you can decide whether you want to do something about it, or some people are actually quite happy being unhappy, and that could be an MO, right? For some people going forward. All right. David Smith says, any advice for writing a creative writing dissertation or thesis? Finding a creative, unique angle. My title is Catabasis, a narrative exploration of the descent to an underworld. I don't have any advice about creative writing because I'm not a creative writer. I think that would be something where you'd actually want to get on an AMA with somebody who teaches creative writing classes. The only writing class that I actually teach is a professional writing class. And that's, for my art and design students at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. I don't help people write creative nonfiction or fiction or anything like that, or poetry for that matter. Um, and okay, so you got a theme, narrative exploration of descent to an underworld. That's very, very broad. Um, can't hurt to narrow it. Maybe you need to specify like which underworlds you're thinking of. Are you thinking of Hades? Are you thinking of the 49 hells in some Mahayana Buddhist conceptions? Are you thinking of Mictlan? What underworld are you actually considering, and do you get out of it? Are you stuck there forever? you know so those are you just going there for a little while to like explore, like Dante in the Inferno? So that's about all I have to say about that. All right, Shiro, we hear a lot about Greek philosophers, and rightly so, but what about Roman philosophers? Do they have an equivalent to Plato, Aristotle, or Socrates? I mean, who's we there? I mean, I know plenty about those guys. Been doing videos on this guy, right? Seneca. He's a major Roman philosopher, one who has actually read quite a bit in the Middle Ages and continues on, and people being interested in him to the present. Or think about Cicero. He's a very important Roman philosopher. And we have all sorts of Roman philosophers who actually wrote in Greek, Marcus Aurelius. Okay, so he's less of a philosopher, more of a political figure. But Plutarch and Epictetus and Musonius Rufus. So we get tons and tons of Roman era philosophers. Do they have an equivalent to Plato, Aristotle, or Socrates? I mean, those guys aren't even equivalent to each other, so I'm not sure what you're asking about. Are you asking, is there anybody as famous as them? I mean, Hume, in the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, just to give you an example, so this is the 18th century, says, the fame of Aristotle is decayed, but everybody's reading Cicero. So there are definitely times when people are much more interested in these Roman era philosophers than they are in the earlier Greek philosophers, and they're all engaging with each other, right? So Francisco says, would you make a video on Nishida? Probably not. I mean, if somebody wanted to commission me, I guess I could do that, but the only reason I did stuff on Nishitani is I needed those videos for an online class on existentialism that I was teaching, and I wanted to include, some of the Kyoto School stuff. So I did a few videos on the self-overcoming of nihilism, and that, that's an interesting text, but I don't really specialize in Kyoto School stuff, and I don't read Japanese, so it's not like I can check the translation. So I don't usually stray into too much stuff that I don't know particularly well, particularly since I have lots and lots and lots of other work to do. I'm shooting videos right now on Seneca's On Anger, and then I've got to shoot some more on Aristotle's Poetics, and then I've got other things lined up. So, all right, here's Ken. Good to see you. Your videos about the cat shelter where you volunteer got me thinking. Are there philosophers who have had a particular impact on our treatment of animals? A cursory search didn't reveal much. Yeah, there's for good or for bad. So the person who gets the most hate in this respect is Rene Descartes. And it's in part because Descartes has this strong position, which he's probably wrong about, that animals are essentially just machines. They don't really think. And if we buy into that, then it doesn't really matter how we treat animals, except in so far as what it says about us, which, by the way, is Immanuel Kant's point of view, right? We should be good to animals, not because they matter in themselves, but because it has to do with our own moral uh, uh, characteristics or qualities or stuff like that. Um, the ancients, the medievals, they tended to think that animals had souls, had minds. By the way, David Hume thinks that animals, even reason. Um, it's sort of a continuum between us. So it's not like all modern thinkers don't think that animals have minds or think. But there was this tendency to say there's a split. We're rational. Other animals are irrational, and that rational or irrational nature is there for rational nature. The Stoics say this, for example, in Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods. The character Coda, who is the Stoic, says this is the Stoic point of view, and we think it's probably right for the time. So yeah, there've been quite a few. If you adopt a utilitarian perspective, you notice that the most famous utilitarian in the present, Peter Singer, is very devoted to animal welfare and argues against what he calls speciesism. So there's some traditions that think that our treatment of animals needs to be improved. And as a matter of fact, I think you can say, even if you were a Cartesian, you could look at contemporary factory farming and be like, "Well, this is terrible. This is bad." In part because it's so dehumanizing for the people who work in those factories, right? So yeah, there's quite a few, and I think there's a lot more people in the present that are specializing in stuff about animals. I'm not a big fan of books that are like, the philosophy of cats or stuff like that. I think it's more interesting just to look at what philosophers have to say without trying to so it's like some people, when I post stuff, they'll be like, cats are super philosophical. And I would say, well, that's not the case at all. They're no more philosophical, I think, than dogs are, or guinea pigs, or, you know, maybe crows are more, because crows are great problem solvers. But anyway, we're starting to get on some tangents now. All right. Gorka says, could you weigh in on how Deleuze is anti-dialectical in the Hegelian sense? I mean, like that whole generation, right? And a lot of this has less to do with like philosophy per se and more philosophy in the French scene in the 20th century. Hegel was a big deal. Dialectics was a big deal. You had, these massive sort of movements in French philosophy that the post-structuralists like Deleuze and Lyotard and Derrida and Foucault are kind of reacting against. And so, you've got all these different things that are kind of mixed together: phenomenology, structuralism, Hegelian, dialectics, Marxism, existentialism, and they're kind of like they've become the philosophical establishment by the time that guys like Deleuze are on the scene. And is Deleuze really anti-dialectical? I mean, not really. That's a word that we use, and it can mean anything you like. Because anytime you talk about dialectic, you got to say, who's dialectic? Hegel's dialectic, Marx's dialectic, different conceptions of dialectic, like those in hermeneutics, like, Gadamer and Ricoeur, Aristotle's notion of dialectic, dialectic in the Middle Ages. They're not all the same thing. And you notice that Deleuze actually likes to sometimes recuperate thinkers and movements that arguably are into dialectic, like, for example, the Stoics, right? But that's because the word means different things. So, Deleuze thinks definitely that Hegel's end of history thing, that ain't the case. He's not super attracted to traditional Marxism. He's not an idealist. He's not a realist either. And like, if we're going to counterpose those, he wants to explore as much as possible. And, you could call what he's doing partly dialectical, so long as dialectic doesn't mean like there's some ultimate metaphysical closure tying everything together. But Derrida is anti-dialectical in that sense. Lyotard is anti-dialectical in that sense. All right, Bozak, why is Marxism so frowned upon outside academic philosophical circles? Um, Mostly ignorance. I mean, I can speak from an American perspective. Most Americans have no understanding at all what Marxism, communism, or socialism would possibly mean as terms, right? They just know they're bad things, and we don't want that, right? I don't know that Marxism is frowned upon as much in other places as it is in the United States, but the frowned upon is most often just due to ignorance and sort of a willful, self-replicating ignorance. Because I mean, there's some things that Marx says where you're like, yeah, okay, that seems right, oh, did you become a Marxist because of that? I mean, I think there's stuff that Aristotle got right. Does that mean I'm an Aristotelian? Um, but it's very blanket, either like, oh, you love Marx or you hate him. I would say that's pretty common. All right. Odia says, how can I better read philosophy? I find it hard reading philosophical books. You're probably not going to like this advice, but there's a couple things that you should do. Quit giving a crap about whether it's hard reading philosophical books. I mean, you may as well say, how can I do better at the gym? I find it hard lifting weights. Well, tough. I mean, yeah, lifting weights is tough, but if you want to do it, you got to do it, right? There aren't any like magic bullets or keys that will open up everything. A lot of it is just like continuing to do the work that you have to do. And everybody finds it hard reading philosophical works. There's some that, I can crack open today, and I may have been reading them for quite a long time and still find them difficult, right? I would focus less on the hard or difficult and more on this is something I actually want to read, and I just got to keep working at it. I mean, you can certainly like consult secondary literature. You've got like massive amounts of resources available to you these days online, ranging from written commentaries to videos to podcasts. Of course, you do have to figure out like who's full of crap and who actually knows what they're doing. You can form study groups there. You can connect with people online and talk with them about, what you're interested in. That might be helpful, but I don't know you. So I don't know what would be the thing that you would need to do, All right. Andre says, just saying hello. Hope all is well. Yeah, things are going pretty good. Semester is slowly finishing up. I got a ton of grading to do, which I'm not enthusiastic about. I don't like grading, but I got to do it. It's very important. But, there's that. And then, I've got some other good projects I'm working on. I want to start exercising again. I've got this nice office to work in, which is very nice as well. All right. Sabarkis. I feel gravitated towards becoming a doctor. I think this may be partly because of my parents. I do enjoy learning about biology. How did you know you wanted to go into philosophy? Well, it was kind of random for me. I've always been somebody who's interested in ideas. I didn't know that was the area that later on, I found out was philosophy. And I had 2 philosophy classes in high school. One was terrible. It was the intro to philosophy class. I've written about this, online. You can just look up, A Tale of Two Philosophy Teachers, and, you know, you can read about Mr. Lowry and Mr. Lorenzo. The second one was actually a religion class, but the guy taught it in a philosophical manner and told us about Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and some other people. And then, I went in the army, and we'd have, philosophical discussions, but we didn't really think of them as philosophy. And then I got out and I worked a while, and then I went to college. And my mom's boyfriend said, when you get to college, declare a major right away. And so I looked down the list and I was like, philosophy, that sounds cool. I'll do that. So they put me in intro to philosophy, and I just kept going from there. So there wasn't a like knew that I wanted to go into philosophy. I suppose you could say, like, when it came to when I finished my undergraduate and I was working again, I had to choose between, like, maybe going to graduate school for mathematics or maybe for philosophy or just taking the actuarial exams because I was a math and philosophy major. And so I decided, well, I think I like philosophy better. I'll go do that. I'd done a lot of work in foundations of mathematics, and I felt like I'd kind of tapped that out. And I wanted to do a lot of, things in language. So philosophy of language seemed like a good way for me to go. And I just kept up with it. I didn't, there wasn't any grand plan or anything like that. There wasn't any like moment of decision. I just kind of chose it. So, all right. I'm not sure how to read the Cyrillic stuff. White Americans have a strange attitude to ethnic background. I've seen many Americans who call themselves German, for example, if their great great grandparent was German. Why is it so? Um, I mean, to begin with, I would say that's not really a strange attitude. We see people in other places doing similar things, and oftentimes being defined. Oh, the dominant group in a particular society. Oh, you belong to this. You're still that, right? So it's not so weird. Might be weird from your perspective, but that doesn't mean it's weird per se. I will say this: there's a lot of Americans who go to the places that their ethnicity, derive from, and they're like, they go to Ireland and they call them, um, plastic patties. They're not really Irish in the full sense. They don't speak Irish. They're not formed by, Ireland's history in recent times. They're formed by when they emigrated. Um, and interestingly, by the way, German at one time was the largest ethnicity here in the United States, especially in this area of Milwaukee, where the Germans were massively important, particularly for our socialist politics, because of the Milwaukee Turners. Um, I think that there's been like this idea of America as the melting pot. You've probably heard that trope being used, and people would be hyphenated American. So, like my family's Franco-American because my mom grew up even as a fourth generation immigrant speaking French before English, because my family's on her side French Canadian. Um, Other people just kind of try to lose their ethnicity, and then other people try to gain it back. But it's part of identity, I suppose. It's a way to connect up with things. I mean, a lot of it is very, what would you call it? Stereotyped, right? What does it mean to be German? Wearing lederhosen and going on Volksmarch, and probably not. Eating sauerkraut, you know. What does it mean to be Irish? Getting drunk on St. Patrick's Day? Not really. So you're right. It is kind of an interesting quirk. It's not as if it's not one that you don't see anywhere else. People having sort of a hyphenated existence, you could say. All right. Nanda says, is Stoicism the most practical philosophy? Can we really put into practice our daily lives what is said in Meditations by Marcus Aurelius and what Epictetus said in the Enchiridion? Yeah, of course you can. People have been doing that for thousands of years, right? Um, as a matter of fact, the monks in the monasteries liked Epictetus's Enchiridion so much that they made Epictetus into a fake Christian and changed, words like philosopher to monk and Socrates to Christ. So yeah, of course you can. But I mean, why would those be the two go-to texts? Of course, that the most important Stoic authors are not Marcus Aurelius. It is Epictetus and Seneca and arguably Cicero. If you actually want to know something about Stoicism, you go to their texts and not the Enchiridion. The Discourses is where it's at, right? And Seneca has his letters and all these treatises. That's the real Stoicism. If all you're doing is working with the Enchiridion and Meditations, that's sort of like saying, I'm going to go to a meal and all I'm going to do is have the soup. I'm not going to have any of the appetizers. I'm not going to have the main course. I'm not going to have the dessert. Just the soup. Why would you do that? Is Stoicism the most practical philosophy? There's no way to say one way or the other. I mean, why wouldn't Epicureanism be a practical philosophy? It is. Why wouldn't skepticism? Aristotelianism is pretty practical if you actually understand it well. So there is no most practical philosophy. And I would advise trying to get away from that kind of thinking. But can you put into your daily lives practices that are from Stoic texts? Yeah, of course you can. I mean, actually, I've got it sitting right here because I'm going to be teaching a class incorporating it next semester. Philosophy can be a way of life, right? And it's not just the Hellenistic philosophies; it's all sorts of things, including existentialism, right? All right. Let's see here. Nanda says, what is your opinion on the book, How to Do the Right Thing? Seneca selected and translated by Robert Castor. They send me those books every once in a while. You've seen me do book reviews on those, how to do a blah, blah, blah thing. I'm not a huge fan of those. The only one that I actually gave a very positive review to is How to Tell a Joke, where it was Cicero, because, they're not cheap. They have the Latin or Greek on one side and the English on the other. And if you're going to do that, you may as well just get yourself some good lobes, right? Like here's Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. It's got the same sort of deal. English on one side, Latin on the other. Those are books that were basically made to try to tap into the interest in ancient philosophy with snappy titles to make a bunch of money for Princeton University Press. So I'm not a huge fan of that sort of approach. And I think if you want to read Seneca, actually just read Seneca. Don't read some little selections from Seneca. You can get Seneca online for free. Why would you pay for a book like that? All right. Ibrahim, how do you think philosophy differs from other disciplines like physics or archaeology in its method towards its subject matter? None of those have a method towards their subject matter. All of them have methods, plural, towards their subject matters, plural. So this is sort of you can't answer this question because it's badly formulated. Physics, if you actually look at physics in its present and throughout its history, it's changed considerably. Not all of them agree on what physics is. There's some consensus, at least, much more at present than in philosophy. So maybe you could say that. Archaeology, kind of all over the map, literally and figuratively. Lots of different approaches to things. It's also, connected up with all sorts of other disciplines, and philosophy. There is no like philosophy as such. There's a lot of different approaches in philosophy that are being practiced and developed and, are essentially traditions. So this is not one of those things where you can really effectively compare them like that. All right. Let's see here. Maybe there's a. So Odia says, I'm a seminarian at Uganda Martyrs Seminary in Uganda, affiliated to Urbanian University in Rome, pursuing a bachelor's degree, currently in year 2. Okay, that's good. I don't see a question there. So maybe we'll come back to that later. Mindoc says, maybe you've answered this somewhere, but why is The World's a speculative fiction series about book series rather than standalone books? I've done some standalone books already. For example, Neil Stephenson's Anathem. So that there's already that's the question is a little bit off. It's got to be a rich narrative world. And generally you get that not just in one book, unless it's a super long book, like 1,000 pages. I think Anathem is not quite 1,000 pages, but it's pretty close. This coming year, as you know, because you follow me in social media, and I just released the list yesterday, we're doing Stephen King's The Stand, also a big standalone book, but it's almost 1,000 pages. So, that's why we do series of novels, novellas, short stories, because we want something that's rich enough to actually have a world, not just, one novel that is doing a little bit of world building, but, a world that gets revealed to us over time. So, you get that better when you got more works to work with, right? So, I mean, if it was just speculative fiction, then maybe we would do single novels, but it's worlds of speculative fiction, isn't it? All right. Sabarkus, I found that benign envy helped me improve a lot in high school. I have mid 90 averages right now. However, I found myself filled with negative emotions after a while. Is passion the best way instead? I don't know, because I don't know what you mean by passion. That's one of those terms that could mean a million different things. Different people use it different ways. So I don't know whether you mean anger, desire. I'll put it to you this way. Aristotle actually has a great discussion in Rhetoric Book 2 of the difference between envy and what he calls emulation. Emulation, zelos in Greek, as opposed to phonos in Greek, is feeling pain when somebody else has something or has achieved something that you would like to be your own, but you recognize that they actually deserve it. So maybe that's what you mean by benign envy, because for Aristotle, envy is always bad, right? As a matter of fact, for a lot of philosophers, envy is always bad. Envy is just feeling pain at somebody else enjoying something, and it's not because they actually deserve it. You actually think that you deserve it and they don't, right? So that's, if you are looking at things in that way and getting competitive with other people, I suppose that could make you feel bad. And, if you recognize that it's not helpful for you, then maybe don't do that. Right? Maybe do something different instead. But I don't know what you mean by passion. So I don't know that would actually help out. All right. GZ says, thank you for the great content. Which thinkers do you have in mind for the next few self-directed study videos? Well, I mentioned Augustine. I want to do some more early modern thinkers, probably some of the ones in that era up to Kant. Couldn't hurt to do some 20th century thinkers as well. I mean, there's literally dozens of people that I probably should do self-directed study videos on that I haven't gotten to yet. Looks like DPP says, when is your next self-directed video release and on whom? So Augustine, later this month if I get around to it. You can always find out what I'm doing by going to the monthly update video or to the Reason IO event calendar. Um, it's easy to find these things out. Uh, is that you? You says, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Georges Bataille. His ideas on transgression and the sacred are so intriguing. Would you consider making a video about him? Well, I don't usually do a video on thinkers. I do series of videos now. And sure. And maybe down the line, if you want it done earlier, then you probably want to commission me to do it because you're asking me to like change my schedule and devote the time and thought to doing that. 99% of the time when I say, hey, you want to commission a video, people are like, oh, no, I don't want to spend money, I just want you to do the thing that I want done, right? And if I did that, I would never get anything done of my own, right? And I probably would have 0 hours in the day because I get people requesting stuff all the time. But Ty is interesting, he's somebody that I read back in graduate school and then read occasionally from time to time. He's drawing on a lot of different thinkers in ways that I think are quite interesting. He will, by the way, going back to like the French philosophical scene in the mid 20th century, and then these people like Deleuze and Derrida and all that coming out. I mean, Bataille is a guy behind that time writing who is sort of like a precursor to those post-structuralists, I would say. So he's worth checking out for that as well. All right. Here's a music question. Nathan, is there a metal band you've come across that has lyrics inspired by philosophy, perhaps referencing a certain concept or thinker? Not really, but I don't listen to a lot of contemporary metal stuff. I'm listening mostly to stuff from the 70s and 80s and occasionally, going into the 90s or bands that are continuing on. And those bands were not primarily about looking for explicit philosophical references and themes to weave into their music the way that bands from like the 2000s sometimes have. I actually prefer not to do that. I don't want everything to be philosophy all the time. I think it's very healthy to actually like live a full life that philosophy is a part of, but not the totality of. I mean, it's always, this is a little bit of a digression. It's always funny that, like I'll post, cat pictures and people will be like, what would Hegel think about that? And I'll be like, who gives a shit? I mean, it's just a cat picture. Enjoy the cat, right? It's fluffy. It's cool. It's, plays around. Just enjoy that, or I'll post a picture. Like later on today, I'll probably take a walk and shoot some pictures of the Menominee River as it's slowly freezing over. That doesn't have to be about Kant or Descartes or anything. Similarly, the bands that I like, they got themes that I guess we could say tie in with metaphysics and epistemology and aesthetics, but I'm not listening to it for that reason. I already do philosophy all the time anyway. I don't need to connect it up with other stuff. So maybe, some people are attracted to things that way. Like, they listen to Rush's Free Will and they're like, yeah, this echoes what John Paul Sartre has to say in Being and Nothingness. And sure, yeah, but you can just listen to the song and think that it's a cool song too. That's the way I kind of do it. Not an academic. How does one begin reading Lacan? What of Freud is most important? I mean, Lacan will tell you what of Freud is most important if you read Lacan, because he makes reference to Freud and he tells you what works he's referring to. It depends on what you're reading, right? So, take, for example, the seminar. I often say like a really good place to start would be like the seminar on the ethics of psychoanalysis. in part because if you're reading that, you probably are at least a bit familiar with some of the other people he's talking about, like Aristotle or Bentham or Kant and all of that. And it's interesting stuff too, thinking about what's the point of psychoanalysis. Um, but he'll kind of tell you, okay, I'm referring to this thing in Freud, because Lacan loves to name drop. He loves to show you how smart he is. So he's not like some philosophers who are drawing on other philosophers and sort of like secretly using their stuff. Lacan is very on the surface about that. So yeah. How do you get into reading Lacan? I mean, there's basically what you have are the écrits, right? The writings. And Lacan tries to make things as difficult and complicated as possible, because he's not actually writing to you. He's writing at the psychoanalytic establishment half the time, trying to say, look how smart I am compared to you dummies, and a lot of them were kind of stick in the mud, doctrinaire people. And Lacan's kind of a jerk that way. And then there's all these great seminars. And I think the seminars are easier to read than the écrit. So I would probably begin with some of the seminars. And it'll be clear enough which Freud text he's referring to. All right, Andre says, after some exposure to Lovecraft through your lectures, I'm feeling apprehensive about the pursuit of truth generally. If you've experienced that, how have you dealt with that fear? Well, I sure as hell didn't have it from Lovecraft. I mean, Lovecraft is kind of a nervous Nelly, isn't he? About all these sorts of things that sometimes you're like, come on, buddy. The nameless shape isn't that bad. So, I mean, why would you be apprehensive about the pursuit of truth? Do you think that it's going to lead you to discovering terrible things that will warp your sanity? You don't know until you get there, I would say, right? So, I mean, I can't say that I ever had an overall anxiety or apprehension about the pursuit of truth. I could say that there have been some things in the past, local truths, where you're like, oh, I hope this is not the case. Do I want to know or don't I want to know? Right. But never about like the pursuit of truth totalitaire, So I don't have something I can relate to in that. Chris says, do you have a metaphysical system you prefer make some of the strongest claims in your opinion? Thinking Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, or Heidegger. I don't have a metaphysical system that I prefer because I'm an eclectic. And so I'm a Ciceronian eclectic, which means that I take pieces of different traditions and thinkers' works and cobble them together into something that I think makes sense for me. And it doesn't always completely add up, but I mean, no system completely adds up either. So, right. But no, I'm not like a Kantian or a Hegelian or a Schopenhauerian or a Heideggerian. And making strong claims, they all do that. The question is whether those claims are actually well-founded or not. Like, Hegel, the idea that history ended, that's a pretty strong claim. Or Schopenhauer, everything is ultimately one primal will. That's a big claim. Do I think it's likely to be true? Not really, So, all right, Tony, will you comment on the proliferation of conspiracy thinking in the United States undermining the authority of science-based progress to stall? I can't, because, the conspiracy is out there and they might be listening. I mean, as a joke, I will say this. So it is quite interesting. When I first started teaching, right, I was teaching ethics classes and occasionally like critical thinking or logic classes. And I'd done a lot of work in logic stuff as an undergrad and grad student. And then I started teaching critical thinking classes as a staple when I was at Fayetteville State University from 2008 to 2011, sometimes 4 classes per semester. And you'd look in these textbooks and they'd have like, some of it's like, Venn diagrams and considering information sources and all that, just, fallacies, how to do formal logic, all the sort of standard topics. And then they would talk about conspiracy theories and about people's misguided ideas about things. And you'd be like, well, that's kind of the fringe, that's for the weirdos way out there in right wing la la land or left wing la la land, or, just weirdo land, not believing in vaccinations or things like that, right? You'd be like, we're getting better and better and better with that. Who believes in this sort of crazy stuff? And then we had the Tea Party, and you were like, you really think that Obama isn't a citizen? Where are you getting this crap from? And it was interesting because a friend of mine was like, look at where people are buying into this, and then look at, how it maps neatly onto the Deep South, at least back in 2008 and 2009. Actually, well, yeah, about that time. And then it kind of got more widespread. And we've seen that, like, now you have like, large amounts of the population who don't believe in things. And you're like, how in the hell did you come up with these ideas? And why would you believe this crazy crap, the conspiracy theories, over stuff that seems to be better founded? And I mean, I don't actually have an answer to what's going on. I just think that we go through periods where like people believe crazy bullshit. And I'm sure that, we could say that the internet is certainly um, uh, made the problem worse, but it's not like a unique problem that is only there in the internet age. But yeah, it's weird to see it, right? All right. DPP, do you plan on doing a self-directed video on Nietzsche or Derrida? Yeah, I mean, I suppose Derrida's not very high in the list because I don't see like a ton of need for that. I actually think that Derrida, and I was somebody who was planning on writing his dissertation on Derrida at one time. I think Derrida isn't really that important, and he's not going to be widely read down the line in the future the way that Nietzsche is. Yeah, I do definitely this coming year Nietzsche. I'll do him. Doc Lime, cats are philosophical dead ends. Trust me, I've tried. Okay, well, somebody's put it to the experiment. But we don't need cats to be philosophical anything. We just need them to be what they are, the second most successful predator creature in the world that we currently know. I mean, octopi may be number 3, or they might be number 2. They're pretty intelligent, and they're multiplying. The trouble is that they die through going through their mating process, and they don't seem to have developed any useful technology, and they don't have the symbiotic relationship that cats have with us. Cats are pretty cool. And it's great that they're just cats, right? Magnolia says, thanks for all the great content. Must have watched hours of your stuff. Okay, well, that's awesome. Glad that you've enjoyed the content. We got a little bit of stuff from people posting before, so I'm going to go back and look at some of the ones that I skipped over because they'd already had answers. So Vedant has a whole bunch of things in here. I will just pick one of them from the start. Why do philosophical geniuses often lose their sanity? I would say that they don't, in part because I would say that philosophical geniuses, it's sort of like when Russell talks about, is the king of France bald or not? I don't think there are such things as philosophical geniuses, because I think genius is a stupid term that just means we don't understand this person and we think that they're really smart and we like to, throw terms around. I don't think that, I think that if somebody really is intelligent and you're intelligent, you can explain why you think that they're intelligent and what's great about them. And genius is just sort of a hero worship word. I am not a fan of it. It did used to have a meaning back in the 19th century, but it's been so overblown that I kind of think it doesn't mean much of anything. But if what you mean to say is, why do people who are great in philosophy, important people, lose their sanity? Well, that's not factually true. If we put off in there, it doesn't strike me that most of the people who I read and engage with have actually lost their sanity. So I think that's part of that romantic idea of, oh, if you're really smart, you're not fitting into society. I mean, the boring truth is that if you're good at philosophy, you're probably good at some other stuff as well. Um, so all right, let's see here. Let's find some other ones that have come up. Um, that I skipped over. Oh, so here's one from Elijah about Lacan. Do you think Lacan's later work on applying modal logic to enjoyment is off base or deficient? Um, I think that Lacan loved symbolism, not just modal logic, but graphs and stuff like that. I personally don't find that stuff particularly illuminating. I think that a lot of people find it cool and are drawn to it, particularly if they don't really understand what the stuff is. It's kind of like a sort of mysticism almost of Lacan, but I just don't find it particularly helpful or interesting or useful myself. So, all right, let's see if there's some new stuff. Okay, so here's a new question from Nathan. Do you consider yourself a film enthusiast? And is there a decade of cinema you're quite drawn to? I recently watched Breathless from the 1960s, considered part of French New Wave. I've never considered myself a film enthusiast in the sense of like having a lot to say about film as an artistic genre or particular directors or things like that. But that said, I do like movies. Right? So, am I an enthusiast in that I watch movies? Yeah. And I, you know, I get bored with a lot of things that I didn't get bored with in the past. Like I find it hard to watch much action movies, in part because things are so stereotyped and kind of boring. I remember years ago. So this is more than 15 years ago. Just there was one of the James Bond movies with Daniel Craig, and I just had to quit watching because the fight scene was going on for like 5 minutes long, and it was just like ridiculous shit. And I was like, come on, there's better stuff for me to do with my time. I like movies that are interesting, that make me think about stuff, where the dialogue isn't so boring and stereotypical. And I'll say I watch less movies these days and more series. Like my wife and I, we just finished watching our entire way through Fringe, which I'd seen a few episodes of back in the 2010s. And then we got into it, and her mom watched it too. And that was some good writing. I mean, it's also quirky, weird stuff that couldn't possibly happen, but it's fine. Sci-fi, right? Or science fantasy, really, more than anything else. Um, but it was good. And I like the depth that's available in shows or movies if you can do them. But I'm not a enthusiast in the sense of like having a stake in it. I don't go to like the film festivals or things like that. And we do have a great Milwaukee Film Festival, and I just don't get around to going to it. But you know, I'll watch movies. I've often thought it would be cool to do a project like writing about movies that really raise interesting ethical um, points, dilemmas, questions, from a philosophical perspective. I think that could be good, but I'm sure there's people doing that already. So I don't necessarily have to reinvent that wheel. Um, all right, here's another one from DPP. I really can't get around the circularity and the phenomenology of Hegel. He says it's imminent critique of every form, but all the antithesis arise due to the presupposition of the whole is true. How to feel comfortable about this after spending a long time thinking about how the Hegelian system fits in coherence with its elements. So I would say that's a mischaracterization of Hegel, and there is no Hegelian system. I mean, there's the phenomenology, there's the science of logic, there's the encyclopedia logic, there's the philosophy of right. They don't all nicely mesh with each other. As a matter of fact, one of the big questions in Hegel's scholarship is how in the hell does the science of logic and the phenomenology, how do they actually comprise a system? Hegel doesn't say that he's doing immanent critique. That's later thinkers who are telling you what they think that Hegel is doing. And you really want to watch out for like the thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing, because that's not Hegel, right? And I'm sure does he have a presupposition of the whole is the true? I guess you could call it a presupposition, but everybody's got presuppositions. And, there's going to be, it's not a question of whether you have circularity, it's whether it's vicious circularity or whether it's useful circularity, right? We all have axioms, we all have starting points. If you think that the whole is the true, which is a viable approach in philosophy, then maybe you find more value in what Hegel's doing, right? If you don't, then maybe it's not going to be particularly helpful, right? Um, all right, let's see if we have any other backlogged questions to hit on. So here's another one from Vedant. How are mathematics and physics linked with philosophy, or is philosophy just the non-technical aspects of it? So mathematics is a very complex set of disciplines that are, connected to each other, map onto each other. There's no such thing as mathematics per se, any more than there is philosophy per se. I would even say there's no such thing as physics per se. There's different approaches, there's different subfields, there's, connections between them. Um, there is no how mathematics and physics are linked with philosophy, because you have to say, well, which philosophy? Take Hegel, for example. Hegel's not a big fan of mathematics, and the physics that he knows in his time is not the physics of our time. So it's kind of apples to oranges sort of thing. There were people like, Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead with the Logicist project, which fell apart because it turns out that you can't actually represent everything mathematically, including mathematics, that were much more amenable to that. Mathematics and physics, kind of unclear exactly how precisely they connect up with each other. But yeah, some philosophy is really making use of stuff like that. Some of it is kind of doing pseudo uses. Like, we mentioned Lacan, right? When Lacan starts getting symbols out, you should be like, yeah, this is probably going to be some bullshit, right? He's using some interesting things, but he's not usually using them the right way. So, all right. Let's see here. LL says thoughts on Nietzschean perspectivism and denial of noumenon. I mean, if we're talking about the Kantian noumenon, I would say that most philosophers who aren't Kant deny the noumenon, right? The purely intelligible thing that we can't know anything about. So Nietzsche's not unique in that respect. Nietzschean perspectivalism is, like a tiny bit of Nietzsche's work. So you don't necessarily have to buy into that to appreciate the other things that Nietzsche probably got right. Certainly, there is a lot of relativity to things and a lot of perspectives that are only partial. You could be an Aristotelian and say that. Aristotle says exactly that when it comes to politics, for example, right? These people get things partly right, but partly wrong, So there's, if we're going to say that Nietzschean perspectivalism means like all we have are perspectives, you could say then, okay, so what changes? What's different? And that would be a good way to go. All right. Aryaman, a young philosophy enthusiast here. Oh, that's good. Your half-hour Hegel series was constructive and helping me better understand Hegel. Do you write yourself? How do you suggest someone approach writing, philosophical writing specifically? Yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of writing over the years, a couple books. Well, one book, couple edited volumes, a lot of popular writing, a lot of academic articles, lots of book chapters. How do you approach writing? Find stuff that you actually want to write about first and get really, really interested in that and think about what you want to say and how you want to organize it and support it. And don't worry so much about like word count or where you're going to send it until you've actually written something. Because you can always, you can always cut, you can always rework stuff. The other thing I would say is, well, there's two related things. And this is something that you see in people who actually do teach writing, like Ursula K. Le Guin, right? She had all these great writing workshops that she would do. And the advice that she gives is echoed by a lot of other people. If you want to be a good writer, you have to write a lot, right? Because you get better at it over time, just like playing a musical instrument, you get better over time. The other thing is you want to be consuming good writing yourself. And if you're studying philosophy, you don't want that just to be philosophy. You want that to be good literature. You want that to be interesting history. You want that to be good, sociological studies that are well written, not just, disciplinarily correct. And over time, in a way that's very difficult to like quantify, you get better at it. And as you get better, you feel more comfortable with it. You are able to take on bigger and bigger projects, I would say. Ileana says, do people's or possibly your psychedelic experiences influence your philosophy? Is there value in drug-induced experience? I don't think there's much. I think that if you need drugs to open the doors to perception, then that's more about you than about anything else. I'm not interested in psychedelic experiences because I knew enough people who were dropping acid and doing shrooms and, oh man, this is so cool. And now I see how everything holds together. I mean, I had plenty of people like that in high school and college, and some of them as family members. And in my experience, they never had anything particularly interesting or profound to say. It's all the same bullshit about, I smell colors, man, or, everything's melting. It's just, it's interesting sometimes to look at like what people have written about their experiences, but they don't seem to be radically different from experiences that other people have had through actually disciplining their minds instead of just taking drugs, So I'm not a fan of that. Monkey Abroad, why is Plato's The Symposium the single best work produced in the history of human civilization? I don't think it is, but it's pretty good, you know? I enjoy it. Um, it's probably Plato's best work, right? Does that mean it's like the best thing ever produced? I don't know about that. Um, but it's certainly a great work and well worth studying, right? So, all right. I can't read the Cyrillic writing. I should learn how to sound that out. I like your thoughts on the movies. I've been actively looking for movies that don't have so much violence or explosions and things like that. As a matter of fact, that's something I'm glad you said that because that jogged my memory. So, having been somebody who worked with explosives in the Army as a combat engineer, one of my pet peeves is like whenever we see explosions in TV shows or movies, it doesn't look like real life explosions. There's too much flame. You have like a little, couple pounds of C4, TNT or whatever, and like, it'll blow up a whole building, and you're like, that doesn't work that way. Or somebody throws a grenade. Grenades don't make a big flame. They throw out shrapnel, and you got to watch out for them, right? But the actual thing is just kind of like a little bit of smoke and a big sound, right? And it's sort of like the you see all these things wherever there's like a hawk or an eagle, they always sample the same sound, that cry, and you're like, damn it, another one of those stupid things. I don't find that particularly compelling, and it kind of bothers me. All right. Surfer Rosa, thoughts on the recent uptick in pop philosophy, Stoics, existentialists, and mystic Jungian stuff seems to be getting a lot of misguided discussion on the internet lately. Well, it's not lately. It's been going on for decades. And yeah, so anytime people are interested in something, there's going to be others who are glomming onto it with minimal um, study of it to try to make a buck or get some clout or something. I mean, so what? People have been doing that forever. Even before the internet was around, there were popularizations and bastardizations of different, philosophical or psychological, or pick whatever else you wanted, approaches to things. It's not really something worth getting upset about. You just, keep calling the bullshit out as bullshit. I don't see it as a recent uptick is part of it. And then Magnolia says, does being an atheist prevent me from fully getting religious philosophers like Hegel or Kierkegaard? Sometimes feel like I'm acting in bad faith, trying to shoehorn their ideas into atheism. Well, yeah, you would be acting in bad faith trying to make them into atheists. So don't do that. You don't have to. But there's nothing that says that you can't actually appreciate other people's points of view that differ radically from whatever it is that you happen to believe right now. I mean, you being an atheist right now doesn't mean you're going to be an atheist 10 years from now, or at the end of your life or anything like that. I mean, if you're the kind of atheist who can't take a religious thinker seriously, that's going to be a big impediment. But that's not there's plenty of atheists out there who engage with religious thought in very thoughtful ways. And by the way, he's a weirdo when it comes to religion, right? Stanley Rosen had this great line about him in his commentary on Hegel, where he said, if Hegel was orthodox, he was in a church of one, meaning he's the only person who believes the thing that he believes about Christianity. So yeah, I think you could certainly read them, get something out of them. All right, I'm going to take one more question and then call it a day so I can eat some lunch and then get to my philosophy chat. Orville says, is there a philosopher or idea in philosophy that you feel is misused more than the others? Now, that is tough because, yeah, there's plenty of ideas and philosophers that do get misused. Saying like which one is more than the others, that would be difficult. I mean, So Hegelian dialectic being thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which is, not Hegel at all, and no actual Hegel scholar thinks that it is. Um, and good historians of philosophy like say, yeah, this is definitely not the case. That's probably a big one. And you see like right wingers trying to say that Hegelian dialectic is behind postmodern Marxism and woke agenda, blah, 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 blah. Right. And you're like, Jesus, these people are stupid or grifters. So that might be one of them. Right. Um, I mean, what other ones are like that? I mean, the idea that Descartes thinks that if you say, I don't think, you disappear. Okay, clear. It's kind of a joke, but clearly um, that one, it's not what he thinks, because he thinks if you're saying, I don't think, you are actually affirming something or denying something, which is one of the kinds of thinking. I mean, what other ones? There's a lot. Plato is living only in a world of ideas. These sort of crappy postcard philosophy things that we get in bad videos and books and stuff like that. Stoicism means just repressing your emotions. You know, there's all sorts of matters like that. So. All right. So I'm going to call it a day. Thanks for all of your questions and comments. And we do this every month. So you can, you know, I do a monthly update video at the beginning of the month. I also put out a schedule in Substack. There's lots of ways to always know what's going on with my channel and what's happening. So I will see all of you next time. Got some other events coming up. Worlds of Speculative Fiction next week. We've got the classic metal class. We're resuming it, but it's going to be on Sunday because of Scott's schedule. We're going to be talking about counterfactual what ifs and how they would have changed music history. And then we got an understanding anger towards the end of the month. And if I get a self-directed study done this month, then we'll have that. Otherwise, that'll be next month. So I will see all of you, and have a great, whatever it is by you, evening, day, morning, could be the middle of the night for some of you. So I will see you later.